Okay, in this slide presentation, I want to talk to you a little bit about thinking about IR and the ways that you can think about it. And I'm going to discuss various ways that people do think about it, and I'm going to talk about the way that we want IR students, graduate students, to think about international relations. Now, these are the ways of thinking, and this is kind of an overview of the slide presentation. There are several ways of thinking about IR. I'm going to go through each of these in subsequent slides. And this list is not exhaustive, although I think it's fairly comprehensive. But these are just different ways that people think about things, and not mutually exclusive. And none of them are bad, but there is a particular way of thinking about international relations. And just to let you know, essentially we want you to be theoretical and methodological in what you do. And so I'm going to go through each of these, and then I'm going to discuss science, what science is, and what critical thinking is, and what we expect people in our program to do. Now, casual observation, this is something we all do, and you will continue to do it, and I do it. I read the paper, and I casually observe a lot of things. And this, in many ways, puts me in mind of Will Rogers, who said, "All I know is what I read in the papers." And what casual observation is distinguished by is that there is no systematic attempt to gain information. There's no theoretical structure to it. It is rather you observe the world, right? And things come your way, and you may do a very good job of observing the world, but there is no focus there. It's not work. You haven't set out the task of exploring the world. It's a great starting point, and hopefully you have come in with a lot of casual observation. Now, a lot of our students are in the military, and a lot of them have gone overseas. The experiences gained there would fall under this heading of casual observation. You may have been to Afghanistan. You probably have learned an awful lot about Afghanistan. There was nothing casual in your being there. It was probably the farthest thing from casual if you were there. But you weren't there researching Afghan society or American foreign policy to Afghanistan. Probably not. And there wasn't a systematic structure. And by systematic, I mean, having been laid out in steps, planned steps. That's systemization. So, and you're going to continue to do it, while you're a student, and you're going to read hopefully you'll read more than you did before, and you can go to various news sources, and it's fine. Very often what casual observation does is it gives you context, it gives you an overview of the world. It very often is how you discover a topic that you're very interested in, and then to that topic you can apply the more systematic methods that I'll talk about. Now, historical thinking, and this is what historians do. This is basically studying the facts of a particular case. And historians, this is what they do. They typically try to look at a case, gain all the relevant information to it, and then sort it out in some way that gets to the essence of what happened. And there's nothing wrong with this, and we owe a lot to historians because very often we use historical works to find out, hey, what happened? And in a particular case. But the question is always with this, why the case? Why are we looking at this case? And the answer to that is something that historians don't do so well with. Usually we're interested in this case because it is a particular instance of a general category of cases or things that happen in the world. We get to call them phenomena, right? That's one of those fancy words we get to use because we're in a graduate program. And you basically put phenomena into general categories, and you're interested in them. You're interested in acts of terror, or maybe you're interested in acts of suicide terrorism, or maybe you're interested in economic crises, or maybe you're interested in economic development. These are all general categories that certain phenomena and certain things will be in and others won't. And historians, they generally push back on the idea of generalization, although honestly they frequently do it. They are usually about looking at the case, understanding the instance. That's really kind of their mantra. And it always begs the question, why the case? Why have you picked this case? Certain cases stand out, and you can look at Pearl Harbor and go, ooh, Pearl Harbor, wow. Why does that stand out, right? And and the answer, eventually you have to put it into a category, and it's surprise attacks, beginnings of wars, preparedness, maybe it's an instance of failed deterrence. Why are you interested in it? And the key thing that will differentiate political scientists from historians in this is once we start, we might be interested in Pearl Harbor. We might look at Pearl Harbor. I think it's very interesting to look at it as a case of failed deterrence, right? The United States was trying to deter Japan from further aggression, so it moved its fleet closer, moved it from the relative sanctuary of San Francisco over to Pearl Harbor. Didn't work, right? It kind of created low-hanging fruit. But, so do we learn from that this is a bad idea? Generally what we'd like to do is we'd like to go out and say, all right, let's once we've identified the category, let's find all the cases. Maybe the ones that don't stand out, especially with deterrence. Deterrence is the kind of thing, when you deter somebody from doing something, well, guess what? Nothing happens. Does it, they don't make movies about it. It doesn't get in the newspapers. Well, maybe it does at the time, but it's quickly forgotten about. And so frequently, if we want to answer the question of deterrence, when does deterrence work, when doesn't it, we like to get all the cases, or a sample of cases from that category of phenomena. You see what I'm saying? So the selection of cases is very important. And then the question also is, what are the facts to study? I mean, there's a lot of facts in Pearl Harbor. We can just absolutely get lost in the facts. We can talk about telegrams that were sent and why they were sent the wrong way, and we can talk about the muddy bottom of Pearl Harbor being too shallow, and we can talk about those radar operator guys who saw the planes and, oops, don't worry about them, they're B-17s coming in. We can get lost in those details. Once you start looking at something in a systematic way, and especially in a theoretical way, because once we have a general category, we can start making general explanations of what goes on in the world. And as I'll talk about later, that's when we start getting into theory. And the cool thing there is once we start talking about the general phenomena, we start identifying things that are important to whether something happens in that general case. In this example I'm using, maybe it's deterrence. We can start talking, when do we think deterrence is successful? When do we think it isn't? Is there commitment? Is there a clear-cut challenge issued to people? There's a lot of statements that people who've studied deterrence have made about the world. And when they point to things that they think are generally important, well, that tells us, hey, let's focus on those facts. Ignore all the stuff that's really interesting and exciting, and forget about the telegram and forget about the radar guys. Let's talk about these things. Did the United States issue a clear warning? Was it clear what compliance was? Did it issue a clear threat? These are some of the things the deterrence guys talk about. So I've been talking about historical thinking, but I've been kind of anticipating the alternatives that we want to use. So political science is a social science. History is a humanities. There are different ways of approaching things. Just keep that in mind. Analytical thinking. Analytical thinking is closer to what we're, now we're getting into more systematic ways of thinking. In analytical thinking, literally the meaning of analysis is to break things down into their constituent parts. And so with analytical thinking, we generalize, right? Here's where we put Pearl Harbor into a category, or here's where we put a financial crisis into a category of, well, I guess financial crisis. And so we create these generalizations of what we're interested in. We establish categories, success, failure, right? There are other, even within the general category of, say, financial crisis or deterrence, there's successes, there's failures. And we also identify variables within the categories. All right, so there's a lot of breaking down into the parts and saying, here are the moving parts, here are the things that are involved. And this is kind of defining, the process of defining. Now we have to keep in mind, definition is not explanation, right? And even analytical definition, where we not only define things, but we define sub parts of them, right? We create a very comprehensive set of definitions. This is not explanation. It merely is breaking things down into its constituent parts. If we want to see how things work, we have to take another step. That other step is to go and think theoretically about things. Theories are basically explanations of the world. Right? Once you've broken the world down analytically into constituent parts, theories explain phenomena, things, I told you we get to use that word. Theories explain phenomena in terms of unobserved factors, right? And this is one way that Lakadish has talked about this. What do we mean by unobserved factors? Well, they're not necessarily unobserved, right? Because we're going to observe them, but they may not be things that we've noticed. Let me just give you an example from physical sciences. We can observe that water boils at different temperatures, right, and at different altitudes, and that's what we observe. Why? What explains that? And is it being farther from the center of the Earth that affects it? What's going on there? And generally, the scientific explanation of this is, what it is it's pressure. That when you go higher altitude, there's a lower pressure. Right? And so that was unobserved. Now, of course, we've observed that there's lower pressure. Believe me, if you go up the Himalayas, you'll know there's frickin' lower air pressure. But that's the unobserved phenomenon. It is not obviously related, right? And so we say, here's this other thing that is affecting it. And, of course, scientists can go test that. They can say, all right, well, if that's true, then if we create a vacuum and with lower air pressure at a lower altitude, we should observe water boiling at a lower temperature. And similarly, when it's under pressure, we should see it boiling at a higher. And anyone who's run a boiler will tell you, water gets hotter when it's under pressure. Okay, so theories are trying to tell us how things relate to one another in the world. And generally, when you start thinking theoretically, you start creating models of the world. And models are simplified views. I like to call them sometimes schematics. A schematic diagram is not drawn to scale. It leaves out a lot of other information. You might have a schematic of a wiring system. You might have a schematic of the exhaust system in your car. And it's not, you're not going to have all the details in there. It's going to be a stripped down, functional view of how the things in your car's exhaust system work, for instance. Theories, not talking about cars, talking about the world, will give you that view of the world. They will strip out things, most information, and they'll tell you, look, here are the moving parts. Right? So ignore the altitude. It's the pressure. Right? All that matters when we talk about water boiling is the pressure. When you talk about deterrence. It'll say, look, here are the things that are important to successful deterrence. These are the 5, 10 things that are important. So ignore all the other stuff, right? It's noise. It's, a lot of stuff happened at Pearl Harbor. Cable telegrams went missing and radar guys saw stuff. But ignore that. Interesting though it might be, it's not important to the functioning of what goes on. This is very important. It simplifies our data gathering in the world, and it simplifies our understanding. A lot of people don't like models because they seem too simple, but models are very important to a theoretical view, and usually people, even if they say they aren't pursuing theory, they are nevertheless pointing to things that are more important, and they're making assumptions about the way the world works, and they probably do have a model. They just haven't been explicit about it. So at least with theory, especially when you're doing explicit theory, you're being upfront and honest. So as I already said, theories tell us the facts that are relevant and how one affects the other. And they generate propositions, right? Or what we call hypotheses about the world. They say, in deterrence, the issuance of a clear-cut threat, right, that involves both the action that the target of deterrence has to avoid and the consequences of not avoiding. A lot of deterrence theory will say that is important. You have to have that for deterrence to work. And so that there's a proposition, right? When we see clear-cut demands and clear-cut threats, we should see more cases of successful deterrence. And that becomes a hypothesis that we can test methodologically, which is the next way of thinking. This leads us to methodological thinking. And methodology in the social sciences refers to, methodological empiricism. And what is that? That's the analysis of data. What is data? Data are, it's a plural, data are systematically observed facts. Right? So once we go out and say, let's look at the military strength of every nation before they go to war, right? And so, or we say, let's find the per capita GDP of every nation. Once we go out and we systematically observe something, then it becomes data. Prior to that, it's just fact, right? And what methodology does is it uses data to test hypotheses derived from theories, right? And so what we're going to do is, this is where the statistics come in, right? Statistics is a way of analyzing. Once we have data, we use statistics to say, hey, is there a relationship, an apparent relationship between this variable and that variable, right? And theory tells us what variables we expect relationships between. For instance, clear-cut demands and threats in a deterrent situation is supposed to relate to success. And so for each case of deterrence, we can have two variables. The demands, right? Actually, we can have, two. Was a clear-cut demand issue? Was a clear-cut threat issued? Right? That could be actually two variables. And then the question is, was that case of deterrence successful? Okay. Statistics provides us a way, once we've got a bunch of cases and we have observed variables, we have what they call observations in each case for each variable, we can go through statistically and say, hey, is there a relationship here? And what statistics does is it tries to see if there is a relationship, and it tests whether or not the relationship seen could be the result of randomness, right? I mean, it could be that there are, where threats are and demands are explicitly issued, there is a higher incidence of success, but, it might not be that compelling, right? And so we say, well, if I flip a coin 100 times, I'm not going to get 50 heads and 50 tails. I might get 60 heads and 50 tails, right? And so, it doesn't mean that the coin is biased or something's going on there. It's a question of what are the odds that that could happen, right? And you could calculate that with a coin toss. Well, statistics, looking at data, and we won't go into it, but basically it tells us what are the odds that we could see this relationship between these variables if there was no connection, if it was just randomness, if we're just looking at an ink blot and seeing a butterfly, right? That's what statistics tells us. So this is an important part of social science thinking, right? Is to, when you first you're theoretical and you come up with general categories and identify variables and come up with propositions about how one, basically cause and effect relationships, how does one factor affect another one, and then we go and we try through methods to see, hey, does this hold up? Do we see this in the world? And that's going to be an important part of scholarly research. An important thing to try to get in is once you have ideas about the way the world works, explanations that you derive from theories, you want to go out and test them, right? See if they work. All in all, this is about being scientific. And there's very often in an introductory IR class, there's some discussion of, can international relations be studied scientifically? And people hem and they haw, and let's just cut to the chase. Yes, if we understand what science is, or if we have a particular understanding of it. The understanding I like to work under comes from a professor I had as a graduate student, and I went to the University of Rochester, and people were very into formal mathematical models and insanely complex empirical studies, and but they were also into doing other things. We had people that did field research, and I was talking with the chair of our department at the time, Bill Riker, not William Riker from Star Trek. His guy was actually named Bill Riker, and he would, set up the department. And I asked him, I said, "What's this all about? What? We have so many different things. In a nutshell, what is it all about?" And he said, talking mainly about the Rochester approach. We were kind of imperial. We were kind of annoying. But he said, the key thing here is when you utter a sentence about the world, you must do something to prove it's right. Right? And that always stuck with me. And to my mind, being scientific is living up to that. Right? It is first trying to utter sentences about the world, trying to make statements about what's going on in the world that we believe are explanatory and enduring in their explanation, and then going out to do something to say, is this correct? Right? And that could be working theoretically, trying to come up with a theoretical model, maybe a game theoretic model to say, does this make sense? If we have rational people making these decisions, can we logically deduce that this is a smart thing to do? Right? Can we come up with an explanation of why issuing threats and demands would be important in a situation like that? Is there a logical reason to think this should have an effect? Or it could be methodological. Let's go out and look at the historical record. And let's do it, though, in a wide, let's look, if we're looking at deterrence, let's look at as many cases of deterrence as we can identify. Ideally, all of them, right? But we're not going to get those. But let's try to get these variables. Let's identify the information we need. Let's try, in each case, let's identify as many cases as possible. And then let's look at it, right, in a systematic way. Systematic comes up a lot here. Using statistical methods, right, that will tell us, that will first of all discover a relationship in data, and then tell us what are the odds that this is just randomness. Right? And when the odds are low that it's randomness, well, then it's significant. Right? So to my mind, being scientific combines analysis. You have to create categories, you have to make generalizations, you have to make definitions of things, It then moves into theory. Once you have these categories and generalizations, we need to create models of the world, explanations about how one variable or one group of phenomena in the world affects another, air pressure and the temperature of boiling. And then you have to be able to make predictions, right? Let's make predictions about what will happen in the world, right? And that's eventually, that's the use of theory, because if you study history, you're looking back, right? To talk about what might happen in the future, well, that's prediction. And you need theoretical explanations to be able to do that. And then, of course, there's methods. We test the above. Now, we're stuck testing on history, but, obviously. But we test these things to say, does this make sense? Right? Is there a reason to think that this stuff, and part of the philosophy of science is we never prove a theory. We subject it to tests, to challenges, what they call falsification, right? And if we fail to falsify the theory, we start getting, yeah, this is pretty good. We've thrown some stuff at it and it survived. So we're increasingly confident about this theory, until a better theory comes along that explains everything the one theory did and explains something else, some other phenomena. It takes a theory to beat a theory. But this is what being scientific is, and this is kind of where we want you to go. We need to push you in that direction of thinking about the world analytically, theoretically, and methodologically, and demanding that others do it. Not being persuaded by these talking heads on CNN, Fox, or God forbid MSNBC. We want you to go in and kind of say, hey, wait, explain this. Let's test this. Here's a proposition. You said something. Let's go test this thing, right? And that's eventually what, that relates to critical thinking, right? And Robert Ennis has defined critical thinking as reasonable, reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or do. And according to him, a critical thinker will be open-minded and consider alternatives, will assess the credibility of sources, will ask appropriate clarifying questions. That first, especially the clarifying questions, the credibility of sources, that's kind of analytical thinking, right? Let's be clear. What do you mean here in this situation? What is an active deterrent? What is a clear-cut threat? Right? That's breaking things down, defining things, right? And then, identifying conclusions, reasons, and assumptions, right? That's part of theory. Theories make a lot of assumptions about the world. We make assumptions about how people are acting. We look at leaders of states and we say, what are they trying to do? We have to make an assumption about what their motivation is. Are they trying to maximize the power and security of their nation? Are they trying to maximize their odds of being reelected? Right? Those are two different, they're both rational, by the way, but they're two different motivations. And what's our assumption about what people are trying to do here? And then the reasons and conclusions, that's the deductive logic. So this aspect, this identify conclusions, reasons, and assumptions relates very much to theoretical thinking. And then when we talk about assessing the quality of an argument, right? Well, that involves both reasons and assumptions. That's looking at the theoretical basis. Why do you think A is related to B? Or we should actually say X is related to Y. That's the terminology we tend to use. And we'll get into that later. But, what's the reason for thinking there's this relationship? And then what's the evidence? We move here into methodology. What's the evidence of it? And then you draw conclusions to the extent warranted by the information and no farther. And this is a really important thing. You become very skeptical about what you know the more you study in international relations. And I've mentioned that when we test a theory, we try to falsify it. We come up with a hypothesis. We look to see, is there a relationship in the data in the hypothesized manner, right? are demands and or explicit demands and threats in a deterrent situation related to success. And then we find something out. We do some research and we say, yeah, we looked at some data and there seems to be a relationship here that is not random. Which, by the way, right off the bat sounds pretty wimpy, right? And then we say, all right, this theory has been, we tried to falsify it and it didn't work. So very frequently people talk about the data supporting the hypothesis. Never proves it, right? We always have to be careful. Dedicated scholars or people who have actually studied something are often they'll get convinced of some things. You do find some things out, but you're always very careful to say, well, this we've only gone so far with this. This is all we know. So you remain skeptical at the end. And people have noticed that in academic writing, the conclusions tend to be fairly wimpy, right? And they tend to be full of hedges. And especially with our military students, they find that writing to be very mealy-mouthed and the kind of thing they could never give a commander in a staff briefing. That's just not going to work. But in here we're very qualified. We want to say, well, this is what we think. There are things we reject, right? There are a lot of things that, and I'll tell you now, if you want to talk to me about a race to the bottom in international political economy, that's something that people have looked at and said, no, we don't see any evidence of it. They reject it. If you want to talk about going on a gold standard, pretty much got to tell you, there's a lot of good research that kind of rejects that idea. Now and then you entertain it and you redo the research, but there are things that we reject. The problem is we don't come out with conclusions of, we think there are better ways of doing money, right? We think this is going on with globalization. Proving things more difficult than disproving them, right? So you're always going to want to keep those things in mind. And I always tell people, you really need to be very agnostic, right? Agnosticism means being skeptical, right? And so being skeptical is kind of the way to go here. And so that's always a helpful thing. It's also, I think, helpful to set your expectations of the program there, that you're going to come out. I think you are going to understand the world a lot better, but you are going to be skeptical of your understanding, and hopefully that leads you to improve on it in the future. And you're going to be skeptical of certitude in statements about the world. And I think that's a very important thing. What do we expect, or I expect, of a MSIR graduate student? And more importantly, an MSIR graduate, because eventually you're going to have to graduate the program. And in my mind, I think about what I want somebody who is a graduate of our program to be able to do. What's the end result, right? And here, teaching a class, we're at the beginning. I think it's good to lay out that, right? Now, this is maybe not an end result, but I really hope that you will leave predetermined ideas behind. Question everything you know to be true, right? Now, a lot of it's going to be true. You're not dumb, but at the same time, you know stuff. I'm not saying that everything, I'm not going to tell you, like John Houseman in The Paper Chase, you come in here with a skull full of mush. I'm not saying that. I am saying that there's probably a lot more certitude about ideas you have than is necessarily warranted. And so, try to adopt this agnosticism about what you know. Be more critical in your thinking, right? Look for alternative answers, and look for those answers that have more evidence behind them, right, that have survived more attempts at falsification than others, right? And don't I have here, don't return to your predetermined ideas. Don't go out looking for information to back up your predetermined ideas. Also, if you do find something you came in, there's a lot of things you already know and that are good, but in studying them and looking at them in different ways, you should get a more sophisticated understanding. You should recognize complexities that you weren't previously aware of. And so you don't return to the predetermined ideas, but you get a more sophisticated understanding of them. Right? And they may be essentially the same, but now, hopefully you're going to have a more nuanced understanding of the world than you did before. Definitely become more theoretical. Right? This is absolutely critical. We are finding that our students today are less and less prone to theoretical thinking. Right? What you want in any situation, whenever you see something happen in the world, you need to ask yourself, what is this a specific case of? What general phenomena are we looking at? For instance, when the Arab Spring hit, right, I looked at that and I was like, okay, I want to understand what's going on here. What is this? Are these revolutions? Are these insurgencies, in the case of Libya, maybe? Or are these democratic transitions, which is a category that you may not have known existed, but that's a category in the field. And in many cases, democratic transition was very good. You could also have civil wars. That's another category. The thing is, you say, what is this a general category of? And then you go out and you say, okay, what have people, if I think these are democratic transitions, what have people said about democratic transitions? Let me go out and find the general statements that people have said. Let me find what they have identified as being the important factors in causing a transition from an authoritarian regime to a more democratic one. And then let me look and see, are these in place? Let me look at what's going on through this lens. Right, this theoretical lens that tells me here are the moving parts, here are the things that are important, here are the things that appear to be, or that we can argue logically are related to particular outcomes. And then I look for that information. That's thinking theoretically. That is using ideas before facts. But you're not coming in biased and prejudged. You're basing it off of the work of other people that have applied a systematic method of analysis, theory, and empirical methodology, and you are trying to understand what's going on through a theoretical lens. That is very important. Right? It's not just about the facts. You need to understand. Facts are cool, and we get to them, right? But ideas are important for understanding which facts to look at, and then what do the facts mean, right? More of one thing, to what extent is economic progress associated with a democratic transition? Economic crisis, how do they play in there? These are the things that the previous research and the theory tells you, hey, when you see more of this, you're more likely to get that outcome, right? And that's how we try to work. So the use of ideas, the use of theories is very important, and I can't overemphasize, or I can't say it too strongly, that that's where you want to be moving in your thinking about the world. And of course, I always want you to desire methodological support for conclusions, right? Eschew anecdotes, and you should, and by now we all know that any Hitler analogy is probably a bad idea, but you should become very skeptical, and I'll talk a little about methodology in this course, and when you take the methodology course you'll learn more, but be very 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 questioning about things. Has anyone really done research? And when they've done research, what has that research shown? And what has other research shown? And where is it? How confident are we in this research? And don't be just taking one single finding. Well, of course, one finding is better than none, but be thinking, hey, this idea might be overthrown next week, right? So what is the status of the research in this area? And that's the kind of thing we want you to do. You can't do it with everything every day of your life, but when you start drilling down on something, that's what I want. I want you to have this desire for methodological support. Okay, I hope that has given you a better idea of different ways of thinking. It might have scrambled your brain a little bit, but this is generally the direction I want everyone to be trying to go.